Ever left a family gathering early just to protect your peace?
She was still raving about his backsplash when the server set down the bread, describing the tile like it had cured a disease, her voice warm and glossy as if admiration were a perfume she only sprayed in one direction. And I watched the fork in her hand bob through the air while she recited the guest list from my brother's housewarming, naming people I had cooked for, covered for, and once even loaned rent to when the market dipped and suddenly everyone remembered I was the reliable one until she landed the question with a little theatrical sigh, asking when I would finally catch up, as if life were a moving walkway I had stubbornly stepped off, and I felt the old reflex rise in my throat, the one that wanted to explain, to calm, to be good. And I cut it with a steady breath and said, not loudly but with enough chill to frost the butter, that mine had already happened, and that she had not been welcome there. The fork stopped, the air went flat, and for a heartbeat I smelled only lemon from the water and the faint scorch of something on the grill, and in that quiet I could hear the sound I used to hear as a kid when I had done something right and someone else still got the ribbon. A thin, high ringing that said you will not be seen here, not today, not by them, and I let the silence stretch because I wanted her to sit in it, to recognize that a boundary had appeared where she had always assumed a doormat lived, and I watched the tiny muscles at the corners of her mouth struggle to decide between a protest and a laugh, the way people do when they are deciding whether you are joking or mutinous. My brother smirked into his water, the same smirk he wore at school events when teachers praised his potential while my completed projects were quietly stacked on a side table. And he cleared his throat to say something about market timing and how not everyone could buy when he did, as if my life could be graphed and gently corrected with his advice. But I leaned back and let him talk himself out, because it was always easier to let the performance end on its own than to be accused of interrupting, and when he was done I smiled in the way that says I am no longer available for coaching, then turned to Mom and asked how the catering had been at his party, whether the sliders were dry like last time, whether the playlist finally skipped the ancient soft rock she thinks is sophisticated, and she blinked because the pivot was mine and the tone was mine and all the control she usually draped over these meals had slid off the chair like a coat forgotten at the bar. I told her the truth without the usual cushioning, that the night I moved in, I filled the porch with people who knew what it cost me to get there, not just money, but the years of swallowing every jab about my late bloom, every comparison to a son whose milestones arrived with trumpets and confetti, and we ate on mismatched plates because I like the sound they make when they kiss, and a neighbor named Carol brought a lemon cake that leaned to the left, and a coworker played piano on a cheap keyboard. We lugged up the stairs, and we laughed until the walls learned my name, and if she had walked in, she would have been a tourist snapping photos she would later crop, because that is what she does with my life. She crops the parts that prove I built something without her applause. She started to say that she would have come if she had known, that of course she would have helped, the word helped arriving with that faint condescension that always means supervised. But I held my napkin in my lap and counted 3 slow breaths because I have learned that the body remembers old arguments even when the mouth plans new ones, and I said she had known enough, because knowing, for her, was always a choice and never a deficit. And I glanced at the server hovering with the wine and nodded, letting the pour happen like punctuation, a long comma to separate what I used to accept from what I would allow tonight. I mentioned, lightly, that I had sent out notes before I closed on the place, not invitations exactly, just simple cards stamped with my name and a little drawing of a key, which I addressed by hand because I wanted the act to feel human. And I let the postal service do what it does, and if those envelopes arrived at a kitchen where mail is triaged by perceived importance and my handwriting reads as optional, then the result belonged to the person who sorted, not to me, and I watched the idea register in her eyes, the subtle tilt that says a memory is riffling for evidence that will not come, and I knew the moment she realized she had seen something like that card and slid it under a coupon because she was running late. The server asked whether we were ready to order, and I said we were, and I ordered with calm, the way you do when you are finally done auditioning for your own family, and after she wrote it down I took out my phone, not to perform but to end a performance, And I opened the shared calendar I used to maintain so holidays would not collide and bills would not snowball and birthdays would not vanish under work, that endless invisible labor I provided like a utility, and with one thumb I removed my name from the recurring tasks and erased the color that marked me as the person who brought dessert and extra chairs and cash for emergencies, and I felt an almost physical lightness in my shoulders, the kind that follows a bag you should never have carried alone. Then, because I wanted this night to mark something other than a sharp remark at a table, I executed a small, decent, and very overdue act of revenge that tasted cleaner than any dramatic speech, and I did it quietly. Tapping the banking app one used for the family pool I had been funding since the first time my brother's car payment mysteriously came up short and Mom's prescription needed a bridge when insurance hiccuped, and I transferred every remaining dollar, my dollars, into a separate account with my name alone, an account earmarked for new locks, a weekend in the desert where nobody knows our last name, maybe a rug that does not apologize for existing, and then I closed the family pool. Not with malice, but with a note that said the service had ended and alternatives were available through adults who live in their own houses, and when the confirmation pinged I set the phone face down and lifted my glass, because if they were going to treat my stability like a faucet they could just twist whenever they were thirsty. Tonight the handle broke off in my hand, and the next sound at the table was my mother's phone buzzing like a trapped fly as the message arrived from the bank, and she stared at the screen and then at me, and I said, very gently, that she might want to read it before the entrees landed, because once she did, she would finally understand what, exactly, she had missed. On the train back from a worksite visit that smelled like drywall dust and new beginnings, I decided that if my life was going to continue being measured against my brother's square footage and curated lighting, then I would stop offering measurements and start offering outcomes, so I sat with a legal pad on my lap and sketched a housewarming that did not ask for permission, did not whisper for approval, and did not make room for anyone who had spent years telling me to be patient because my time would come once he was finished arriving, and I wrote names that felt like anchors: Carol with the lemon cake that leans, Jorge who can fix anything with a crescent wrench and a prayer, Serena who knows which rug will outlive a spilled Cabernet, my boss who remembers my deadlines without a calendar, and the young couple downstairs who lend me their drill and pretend not to hear when I practice piano too late, and I stared at the space on the page where family should have gone and felt the old twitch in my hand, then let it pass like a weather system that no longer includes me in its forecast. I bought a stack of cream cards from a little stationery shop that smells like cedar and ink because I wanted the act to feel intentional rather than mass-marketed, and I stamped a tiny key in the corner with a brass stamp that left a faint sunburst like a secret. And I wrote only my name and the new address and the words "no gifts, bring your appetite," because I did not want to beg for attendance or advertise a theme like the parties my mother loves where everything has a slogan and the food tastes like an apology to the decorations, and I addressed one of those cards to her with my neatest handwriting, knowing exactly how her kitchen mail sorting ritual works. The fast flick through envelopes with anything that looks like an ad tossed under the junk drawer for later. And I smiled, because the card looked exactly like the kind of boutique mailer she dismisses when she is late and her phone is buzzing with updates from my brother about tile samples and champagne flutes. People arrived carrying plants and lopsided flowers and a glorious mess of dishes that had real flavors rather than polite suggestions, and the hallways smelled like cumin and butter and laughter, and the stereo decided to cooperate for once, though it coughed during an Aretha Franklin bridge, and we all applauded because even my technology felt more welcome than I usually do at my mother's table, and I watched walls that had been anonymous learn the shapes of the people who will probably help carry me through the next decade if I am smart enough to keep them close, and for one long moment I felt the kind of quiet I used to chase in grocery aisles after holiday fights. The quiet that arrives when nobody is taking your inventory and nobody is performing the role of the golden one while you serve as scenery. It would be a lie to say I did not think of her during the toast Carol insisted I make, because I did. Not with cruelty, but with the kind of clarity that arrives when you stop trying to be the translator of your own life for an audience that refuses subtitles, and I lifted my glass and said I was grateful for a roof I signed for myself. For a job that does not ask me to be smaller, for neighbors who forgive clumsy piano, and for a night that did not require me to apologize for existing, and everyone cheered and banged their forks against mismatched plates like a drumline made of thrifted porcelain, and I caught myself wondering how my mother would have staged this moment if she had been in charge, and I saw it so clearly, scripted applause. A tasteful centerpiece, my brother delivering a speech that somehow became his, and then the picture dissolved like a commercial cut short, because she was not there, and that was not an accident or a tragedy. It was the first honest decision I had made in a very long time. The next morning, with the apartment smelling like citrus peels and warm dust, I brewed coffee and sat at my little table that wobbles unless you wedge a folded grocery receipt under the back leg, and I wrote a thank you card in the same neat hand to my mother. A card that said thank you for understanding that not every room requires your approval to exist. Thank you for giving me the space to celebrate without a scoreboard. Thank you for declining an invitation you never recognized, and I sealed it with the same tiny key stamp because I liked the symmetry, and I walked it to her mailbox because I wanted the reply to arrive before the gossip, and I imagined her opening it and feeling that small sideways jolt she hates. The one that arrives when she realizes she is not the narrator of this chapter, and it tasted like victory even though it looked like courtesy. She called that afternoon and left a message that sounded like a teacher trying to keep her voice steady while the class rebels against worksheets, asking whether there had been some misunderstanding and whether I had really meant what I said at dinner about not being welcome, and whether I would at least send photos so she could see how the paint color turned out and whether the plans looked cheap. And I listened to the message while wrapping glassware in old newspaper and laughed into my shoulder because I could hear, beneath the sugar, the old compulsion to audit and to rank and to nudge me toward a life that made better sense to her, and I decided that since the party had already given me courage, I might as well use it before it expired like a coupon, so I opened my email drafts and found the folder labeled Family Logistics that I have maintained like a harried concierge for years. And I pulled up the guest list for my brother's housewarming that she had forwarded with smiley commentary about themes and trays, and I hit reply all with a note that said my celebration was lovely and sufficiently funded, that no casserole pans were required, that photos would remain in the hands of those who actually showed up, and that future inquiries about my pace in life should be directed to the part of the brain that confuses ownership with worth. And then I pressed send and watched the little paper airplane shoot across the screen, because sometimes revenge is not fire. Sometimes it is a graceful refusal delivered to the exact room where you used to beg for a chair, and as the confirmations pinged and my brother's predictable attempt at a joke landed like a punctured balloon, I set my phone face down and slid the bolt on my door with a satisfaction that hummed through the metal, knowing that the next phase would require a sharper tool than a card or a quip, and that I already owned it even if they did not know its name yet. The morning after the emails detonated, I opened my laptop with the same controlled calm I use for quarterly reports, because if I had learned anything from the years of being the reliable one, it was that real change is not a speech or a scene but a series of dull, decisive clicks. So I began by inventorying the invisible scaffolding I had built around my family, the subscription logins that kept their weeknights humming, the shared rides account that made last-minute errands doable, the cloud storage plan with gigabytes of baby photos I never took, the emergency contact forms that named me as the adult in charge even when the adults in charge were already in the room, and I started to remove my name with the kind of meticulous, bored patience that bureaucracy respects, one checkbox at a time until the structure I had propped up out of habit could finally feel its actual weight. I moved through my phone like a quiet electrician, not severing power to be cruel, but to make sure I was no longer the grid, and I changed the passwords I had set to be easy for other people to remember, filing the new ones in a place where only I could find them. Then canceled the streaming family plan with a courteous note to customer service that said the household was dissolving and the charges should follow the head of it, which was not me, and I pulled my name from the rideshare profile. My mother used like a magic carpet when errands multiplied, replacing the payment method with a blank where a card number should be, and I unsubscribed from the weekly wine box that kept delivering to my brother's porch with my discount code applied like a bruise. And I sat with the silence that follows 100 quiet departures and felt, for once, not guilty but clean. In the afternoon, I drove to the hardware store that smells like cut pine and rubber, told the clerk that the cheap lock I had installed on moving day had never felt like mine, and watched him package a deadbolt that looked like a promise. Then carried it home like a trophy I had wrestled from my own reluctance. Half an hour later, with the door propped and my drill coughing in steady bursts, I swapped out the cylinder while my phone buzzed with the housewarming photos friends were still sending. Grainy and gorgeous and full of faces that looked pleased rather than strategic. And after the last screw tightened, I took the spare key my mother had finagled on the logic that emergencies happen to girls who live alone and pressed it into an envelope with a strip of packing tape so it would not rattle. And on a note card, I wrote only one line. "Thank you, but this is not your emergency anymore," and I mailed it with the same small, private satisfaction I felt when I paid my first rent without calling anyone to brag. That night my brother tried the old trick, the one where he drops by without warning, lets himself in like a sitcom neighbor, and opens the fridge before he says hello. But the bell camera lit him in gray and his reflection stared back at him from the new hardware like a closed book, and when he jabbed the button I answered through the speaker with a politeness I didn't recognize in my own voice, explaining that visits now required the radical innovation of advance notice, and he joked badly about me being dramatic and asked whether he could just come in to grab the toolbox he had once lent me, and I smiled into the mic and told him the toolbox was mine because I bought it, though I would be happy to schedule a time to let him admire it. And I watched his grin wobble as he realized the stage directions had been rewritten without him. Because I wanted the change to reach beyond keys and apps, I pulled up the HR portal at work and scrolled to the emergency contacts that had described my life for years, a script where my mother's number stood first and my brother's second like a reflex. And I replaced them with Carol and Jorge, the neighbor who knows the building's quirks and the friend who shows up with a socket set and coffee, and I clicked save and took a breath that felt wider in my chest, then opened my bank's dashboard to stare down a habit that had disguised itself as virtue. The transfers to the family pool had already been closed in the restaurant glow, but the autopays that spiraled around them, small and insistent as gnats, were still humming along. So I canceled the last of them and redirected the freed-up cash to an account labeled after something I had convinced myself was frivolous: piano lessons with a real teacher, a weekend in a cabin with no cell service, a rug that did not apologize by hiding under the couch, and the thought that these purchases might be considered petty by the committee that used to run my life made me laugh out loud alone in my kitchen, which felt like an exorcism performed with a spreadsheet. The first retaliation arrived exactly as expected and exactly off-key, not from my mother, but from an aunt who had always auditioned for the role of family diplomat, a voicemail that wandered through compliments and scolding, asking why I was cutting myself off from my roots and whether I would remember who helped me when I needed help again, and I listened to it twice without anger, then exported the message and forwarded it back with a transcript of every monthly transfer I had made for the last few years attached below like footnotes, not to humiliate her but to remind her that narratives are never accurate when written by people who do not track deposits. And I added a line that said I was content to be called selfish by anyone who had benefited from my generosity in silence, which is not vulgarity so much as arithmetic. When the sun dropped and the apartment went blue, my phone lit up with a bank alert that looked like déjà vu wearing a suit, an attempted draw from the now-closed pool labeled with my brother's account nickname, and a shrug of a memo line that read "Hold me over till Friday." And the system had declined it with the kind of crisp finality I wished I could bottle and pour into every future conversation, and I stared at the screen for a long beat before the second message arrived, not from the bank, but from my mother, a long paragraph where her voice cracked and reassembled, insisting that my changes were cruel and that I had embarrassed her, ending with a sentence that made my thumb go cold because it told me exactly how far she was willing to go next. And as I read it, I understood that the problem was no longer budgets or boundaries, but something older and sharper, and that the only way through would require a move so clean that even I might hate myself for making it. Her message, sent in that brittle formal voice she reserves for doctors and principals and anyone she hopes to intimidate, claimed that I had humiliated the family by publicly withdrawing support, and that if I insisted on making things transactional, then she would be forced to rethink certain arrangements, a phrase that landed with the dull thud of a threat wrapped in linen, and beneath the indignation marched the line that made my thumb go cold, a neat sentence about my ungrateful attitude at work that she would regretfully have to raise with the appropriate people, as if my supervisor were a parish priest prepared to absolve me after a scolding. So I put the phone on the counter, poured coffee I did not need, and decided that if she wanted to escalate in a language she believed I did not speak, then I would answer in fluent documentation, because nothing untangles a snarl faster than a paper trail laid out like a highway. I opened my files and pulled receipts that read like a ledger of invisible labor, the rideshare top-ups that smoothed their logistics, the grocery deliveries I ordered to arrive during storms and long work weeks, the phone plan that began as a favor when my brother's startup performed a theatrical dying swan and somehow became permanent, the cloud storage billed to me because you're the organized one, the appliance warranty for my mother's washer that I had purchased outright when hers failed, the week before Thanksgiving, and she wept over ruined pies, and I sent 3 certified letters before lunch, one to the bank formally revoking every third-party authorization that had ever been added in a moment of chaos, one to the phone carrier initiating a transfer of billing responsibility that would escort each adult to their own account like a polite usher, and one to the Homeowners Association for my mother's building with a copy of the autopay cancellation and a note that future communications should go directly to the owner of record rather than the daughter, who acts like a human checkbook, and the satisfaction I felt did not taste like vengeance so much as hygiene. Because I have learned that rumors flourish in the absence of boring facts, I created a tidy email addressed to the aunt who moonlights as a family newswire, attaching a spreadsheet that itemized my support over the last few years with dates, amounts, and a brief description written without bitterness, and I added one paragraph that said I was proud to have helped when I could, that I was done now because I needed the same care I handed out like mints, and that any characterization of my decision as abandonment would be a misreading not of intention but of boundaries, and I hit send without shaking, then placed my phone face down since my pulse still spiked when it lit up with her name. In the afternoon, I drove to the appliance store with the washer's serial number scrawled on an index card and asked to schedule a warranty inspection. Not because I wanted to strand my mother with laundry, but because I had paid for the machine in full and registered it to my name when she insisted she would square up later, and later had turned into holidays and anecdotes. So the technician scheduled a visit and asked whether the unit sat at the original delivery address, and I said it did, and gave my mother's apartment number, then returned home feeling like a very calm villain in a polite novel, since the most satisfying consequence is sometimes the one that treats you like a person who owns things. My brother tried the classic deflection that evening, calling with a breezy tone he uses when he is about to ask for something he has already decided is his, suggesting that the account changes were a bit aggressive, and that strangers in customer service cubicles should not be allowed to define the love within a family, which might have landed if I had not spent years being told by the same voice that budgets are real and calendars are binding, so I told him, in a sentence constructed to survive screenshots, that adults pay for their adult lives, and that I trusted his entrepreneurial spirit to solve the fascinating challenge of his own phone bill. And when he sputtered something about legacy photos, I reminded him that I had exported every album with his children's names and shared them to a new folder that did not require my credit card to exist. A gesture I would never have thought to mention aloud before this month, when clarity began to feel less like cruelty and more like a vitamin I had been too polite to swallow. The technician texted the next morning to confirm her arrival window, and I forwarded the message to my mother with a brief note in the same neutral style I use with landlords, explaining that I would be present because the warranty is in my name and because the last time a repairman visited her apartment she had signed for a part that voided a return, and the response arrived in a rush of adjectives about disrespect and spectacle, accusing me of staging a scene and promising that she would not be made a fool of in her own home, which would have been funny if it were not the exact posture she had adopted at my expense for years. So I breathed in and wrote back that nothing theatrical was planned. Only a standard service appointment and a standard transfer of ownership if she wished to take on the warranty herself, and I thought for a moment that the exchange might cool. That we might practice behaving like citizens in a shared city rather than lifelong contestants in a fixed pageant. What arrived instead, hours later and minutes before I had to present a quarterly update to a room of people who judge me only by what I can prove, was a screenshot of a draft email addressed to my boss with a subject line that paired my full legal name with words like unstable and concerning, accompanied by a text that said she hoped she would not have to send it, but that she would if pushed. And my body performed that old hot-cold wave that children of unpredictable parents learn to mask. With a tight smile, and I stared at the screen long enough for the protective anger to arrive, the kind that does not start fires but locks doors. And I forwarded the draft to HR with a calm explanation and the requested documentation from the last month of financial transitions, adding a brief note that a family matter might escalate into workplace harassment and that I preferred to disclose it rather than let it appear as gossip, then walked into my meeting and delivered my graphs without my voice shaking, because the oldest part of me still knows how to function under fire even when the arsonist is carrying my grandmother's cheekbones. In the quiet after the meeting, when I finally let my shoulders drop and allowed myself exactly 3 minutes to be furious in an empty conference room that smells faintly of carpet glue, my phone buzzed with a new notification from a number I did not recognize, and when I opened it I found a photograph of my own front door, the new deadbolt gleaming like a small sun, and a caption that read, "We can still talk this out if you open up," which might have been neighborly if the hand reflected in the black glass of the peephole had not worn my mother's distinctive ring, so I did the only thing that made sense for a person who is done performing hospitality for people who arrive to overturn the furniture, and I powered the device down and turned to the window, where the city moved without me for a long, clean minute, while the thought that had been forming since the restaurant finally stepped fully into the room and sat across from me with its coat unbuttoned, patient and inevitable, insisting that if I wanted peace to be more than a weekend hobby, then I would have to choose one last move that could not be undone without breaking the entire board. The photograph of my own door lingered in my mind like a watermark, even after I powered down the phone and pressed it face first against the desk, as if the weight of plastic and glass could muffle what the ring on her finger had already declared. And all through the evening I felt the pressure of that image, the way a toothache pulses even when you do not touch it, reminding you that something is not just broken but waiting to become infected, and by the time the sun slid behind the rooftops and the city dissolved into its usual mixture of headlights and sirens, I understood that the only way forward was not another argument or another letter or another transfer of funds, but a clean severing, sharp enough that even if they tried to stitch the pieces back together, the scar would remain too jagged to ignore. So I sat at my kitchen table, the wobble steadied now by a real wooden shim instead of a crumpled receipt, because I had decided that my own stability deserved permanence, and I opened the drawer that held every practical thread of my connection to them. Spare keys I had never returned, joint account cards tucked into envelopes for emergencies, printed contracts that still bore my signature as guarantor for services I had long since paid off, and I laid them out in a neat line like exhibits in a trial where I was finally the judge rather than the defendant, and one by one I slid them into a heavy manila envelope, not with rage, but with the kind of meticulousness that comes from understanding that rituals, however private, matter more than declarations, because once the objects were gone I would no longer have to defend my decision with words. I wrote a letter to accompany the envelope, a letter that did not explain or justify but documented, listing each item enclosed with the clinical precision of an inventory sheet, and beneath the list I wrote a single sentence: "From this point on, you will manage what belongs to you, as I will manage what belongs to me," and I signed it not with love or resentment, but with my full name, because that was the signature of an adult who no longer required permission to define her own borders, and I sealed the package with tape that screeched across the cardboard in a sound so final it startled me. The next day, I walked it to the courier's office rather than mailing it in the neighborhood box, because I wanted a receipt, something stamped and dated that would outlast any denial. And I stood in line behind people juggling returns and holiday gifts while holding my envelope like a brick, and when the clerk weighed it and asked whether the contents were fragile, I nearly laughed, because what could be more fragile than the illusion that families can endlessly consume one person's resources without ever producing gratitude? And yet I said no, not fragile, and paid the fee with a calm I had not known even when I signed the closing papers on my own apartment. That evening, perhaps sensing that the tide had shifted beyond her reach, my mother sent one last message, not the draft threats or the long guilt paragraphs I had come to expect, but a voice note where her tone cracked and surged like someone rehearsing both apology and attack in the same breath, telling me she had only ever wanted the best for me, that she had never meant to hurt me, that families sometimes get tangled, but blood is thicker than pride, and that she hoped I would come to my senses before it was too late. And though I listened twice to be sure I had not missed some rare sincerity, what struck me most was not the words, but the pauses, the moments when she seemed to wait for me to interrupt, to fill the silence with concessions the way I had always done, and when I refused to provide that script, the note ended abruptly, as though she had walked off stage mid-performance. I did not reply, not because I lacked the words, but because the words no longer mattered. Instead, I opened my phone settings, navigated to contacts, and one by one I pressed the option that said block caller, watching each familiar number vanish behind a quiet firewall. And when I reached my brother's name, I hesitated only long enough to acknowledge the small grief that comes from realizing you are deleting not just a number, but the last thread of childhood's imagined safety net. And then I pressed confirm, and the list grew shorter, and the air in my apartment grew lighter. For the first time in years, I cooked dinner without bracing for a call or a message or an obligation disguised as a request, and I ate slowly, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the city through the glass, and I realized that peace, the kind that cannot be bargained away, does not arrive with a speech or a climax, but with an absence, the absence of demands you never agreed to carry, the absence of voices measuring your worth against someone else's square footage, the absence of a fork suspended in midair waiting to slice you open. And as I sat there finishing my glass of wine, I allowed the silence to grow around me, not as loneliness, but as proof. Yet, even as the stillness settled, I could not pretend there was no shadow under it, because the question that hovered, whether I had liberated myself or exiled myself, remained unanswered, and perhaps will always remain unanswered. And maybe that is the price of finally refusing to be the household's unacknowledged scaffolding, the one who holds everyone else aloft while being told she is falling behind. And as the night deepened, I accepted that ambiguity like a tenant signing a lease, aware that the space comes with flaws, but grateful that, at last, it is mine.